Quiero decirles
ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for returning to the hall for this fifth plenary session. Let me begin by thanking very much the Minister of Defense, Don Juan Carlos Pinzón Bueno, for the marvelous gala dinner we had last night and for his remarks and for the wonderful conversation around the table that it inspired. To all the speakers and delegates at this morning's special sessions, I had the privilege of going to all four and saw that the discussion was really very strong and went into a lot of detail that we will be trying to capture in the report that we make of this IISS Cartagena dialogue. This fifth plenary is an attempt to look forward at an agenda for Trans-Pacific cooperation, and we're bringing four extremely different perspectives together and hope that as a consequence of that we'll be able to tease out a few thoughts about the nature of Trans-Pacific cooperation, not just between the Pacific Alliance as an organization, but the countries of this region individually and the other side of the Pacific. Delighted to have here four speakers. Mauricio Cárdenas Santamaría, the Minister of Finance and Public Credit of Colombia. Dr. Marty Natala Gawawa, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia. He's played a big role in G20 and ASEAN meetings. Celso Amorim, the former Minister of External Affairs and former Minister of Defense of Brazil, who has attended IISS meetings in the past, and Liok Boon, Deputy Secretary of Trade, Ministry of Trade and Industry in Singapore. And Singapore is a host country to the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue, to which we'll return the 29th to the 31st of May this year, in the year of Singapore's 50th anniversary of independence. The form at this morning's plenary is the same as one's yesterday mornings. Each of the speakers will go to the podium and speak for about 8 minutes or so, come back here, and then we'll take a collection of comments and questions from the floor, and then wrap up from each of the four speakers in reaction to the ideas that have been presented. As the Minister of Defense said yesterday, one of the advantages of the security gains that have been made in this country is that the economic potential of the country can be more powerfully exploited, and to give us a sense of what is happening with the Colombian economy and how the Colombian economy is beginning also to look outwards and inspire inward investment. It's a delight to have Minister of Finance to address it. Mauricio Cárdenas.
Well, thank you, John. I think I'll speak in English because it'll make life easier for our colleagues in the panel and for most of you. Well, let me first start by thanking you, the IISS, for this invitation. Also, Juan Carlos Pinzón, a very good friend and colleague who's co-sponsoring the event. It's great to have you all here in Colombia. You heard President Santos on Friday, and I don't have much to say or to add to what President Santos already told you, which is essentially how thrilled we are to have you all in our country. This is a particularly important time for us. Our economy is doing remarkably well, despite a shock, which is a severe reduction in our oil prices, which is essentially Colombia's main export. But despite that, Colombia has been able to keep an economy that is growing at a relatively healthy rate, 4%, which is it makes Colombia one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America. We were definitely the fastest one last year. We're very proud of that. We grew almost 5%. And this year, given the shock to oil prices, we're expecting to grow slightly less, but still quite above the average of the region, which is very important, and it's very positive. So you may wonder, and this is a question I get asked all the time, why Colombia is outperforming the region, why Colombia is doing relatively well. And I think the main reason is that we have trust. We have the trust of the Colombian consumers, the Colombian business community, and most importantly of the foreign investors. We're going through a very rapid expansion of foreign investment. It's not just in mining and oil, which are two main sectors in terms of foreign investment, but we're also getting very significant investment in other sectors. We're in Cartagena, which is definitely our most important tourist destination. And as you can see, I'm sure you've gone out of the hotel, you've seen the city. There are a number of initiatives taking place in the tourist sector here, which are just amazing. I mean, we're having an expansion, almost a boom in terms of real estate, and the main hotels are all expanding here, which is very important. That means jobs, that means better incomes. We actually have very clear that our main goal is to reduce unemployment and poverty. We're succeeding in that regard. With the expansion of the middle class. What brings investors to Colombia? Essentially that, the expansion of the middle class. The reason that many investors see Colombia as an opportunity is that we have a large market, almost 50 million people, and year after year we've been able to reduce unemployment, expand the middle class, and consolidate our domestic market, and that's very important. That's a main engine that help us grow. One of the anchors of our model is what President Santos is, and I see myself fully identify with his vision. He's a believer of the third way of politics, which essentially is the combination of two models that until recently were quite antagonistic. On the one hand, we conduct our macroeconomic policies with very responsible criteria. We feel that it's very important to keep inflation very low, to keep the fiscal deficit also fully under control, low debt to GDP ratio. Colombia's public debt to GDP, it's only about 33%, and we have a very strict fiscal rule that forces us to reduce the deficit year after year. So as you can see, on the macroeconomic side, we are the opposite of populism. But then we also see the state as a very important instrument to promote redistribution, to tax and tax more the people that have more capacity, very progressive taxation, including, for example, something that the world is just beginning to discuss, which is the wealth tax. We've had the wealth tax from, the last decade or so, and we use it with a very progressive criteria. But we also focus our expenditures on those programs that have the largest impact in terms of reducing poverty and inequality. So we are very progressively thinking, we have a very liberal conscience to use the state for redistribution. So as you can see, these two models that were two separate ideologies are combined here in a model that is working, and that the people of Colombia like it because it delivers. It gives good results. And that's what really supports the continuity of this model. This is very important, and it's something that we firmly believe and we promote. In these times of lower oil prices and in general lower commodity prices, we will begin to appreciate in its full dimension the benefits of the Pacific Alliance. In some ways, the Pacific Alliance was an idea that was conceived at the time when our four economies, Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Colombia, were all experiencing high commodity prices. And I think at that time, we didn't fully visualize the importance of the Pacific Alliance for this next era, an era with lower commodity prices. This boom that we've had for the last decade, we're not counting on commodity prices to go up again anytime soon. So it's when we have to go back to our basics. And our basics, in the case of Colombia, are the manufacturing sector, the agricultural sector, services. And for those sectors, the Pacific Alliance is essential because it expanded our relevant market from 50 million people, which is the population of Colombia, to 200, which is the population of the countries of the Pacific Alliance. And of course, exports of manufacturing goods is very important to us. Colombia has a very diversified industrial base, and we need to expand it, and the alliance and weaker currency are going to help us promote that. But the next step is the Asia-Pacific. And Asia is very important in our agenda. I think we have two key initiatives in our international economic policy agenda. One is our accession to the OECD. As you know, Colombia is aspiring to be a member of the OECD, something that in Latin America has been achieved by Mexico and Chile. We want to follow. We're working very hard. It's a priority for us. The second strategy is our integration with the rest of the world through the Pacific Alliance, and especially with the Asia-Pacific. I'm going to be traveling to Korea by the end of the month, and this is going to be the first opportunity to launch our recently approved in the Colombian Congress free trade agreement with Korea. I'm also planning to go to Japan, where we are negotiating an EPA, an economic partnership agreement that goes beyond trade. It's a cooperation agreement. It's going to be very important for our SMEs, and that's our next step in terms of integration with the Asia-Pacific. We have a number of bilateral investment treaties which have been negotiated in the past, have been approved, or which are under negotiation. President Santos already mentioned the importance of our accession to APEC and the importance of our negotiations in the bilateral and multilateral schemes with Asia. Why we put so much attention to Asia? Well, because we think that one of the sectors, and with this I'll finish, John, which is we're in the middle of the peace process. In fact, this morning we participated here in Cartagena in a march promoting life, and as we said there, the best way to protect life and to make sure that the value of life is fully appreciated by everyone is to have a peaceful society. Peace is really the road to security. And part of the peace process and hopefully a peace agreement and an end to the conflict will be the expansion of our agricultural sector. As you know, Colombia has large areas of land which are undeveloped, very weak state presence, and those are the areas that will benefit the most with a peace agreement. So we have tremendous potential in agriculture. We're planning to do sales of something like the Brazilian Cerrado. That's our vision. Where are we going to sell all these agricultural products? Well, essentially in Asia. So this could be the basket for Asia in terms of products that are necessary for expanding the living standards of the very large population in Asia, especially in China. So that's a way to connect peace, free trade agreements with the Asian countries, and the development of the agricultural sector in Colombia, which I think is going to be the sector that will most directly see the peace dividend in our country. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Pat Marty.
Thank you very much, John. Excellencies, dear friends and colleagues, I'd like to begin by joining others who have spoken before me in thanking the IISS and especially, of course, our host government, the government and people of Colombia, for their hospitality and the warm welcome that has been extended to all of us here in the beautiful city of Cartagena. May I also begin by paying tribute to the tremendous intellectual leadership that the IISS has shown over the years in promoting dialogue, in promoting cooperation in many parts of the world, not least in the Asia Pacific, and through this meeting between Asia Pacific and Latin America as well. I've been asked to speak this morning a little bit on the issue of an agenda for trans-Pacific cooperation. I believe this is a very timely and important subject matter, not least because of the geopolitical and the geo-economic shifts that we are seeing throughout the world, marked among others by the increasing prominence of countries of the Asia Pacific and of course countries here in Latin America. And therefore what we do as regions, the Pacific, Asia Pacific and Latin America, will have implications far beyond our own shores. It will have implications globally. And therefore we have an opportunity here to get it right and therefore making a meaningful impact on global developments. I'd like to begin with a thought that I had shared yesterday as well, in wanting to promote or identify a Pacific agenda. One must not be remiss of the already existing agenda and processes that is prevalent within our region. And in mentioning them now, I'm not trying to discourage further efforts in communications between the Pacific, Asia Pacific and Latin America, but simply wanting to place our current efforts in a wider context so that we ensure that there is a value-adding contribution that we will be making. I am most familiar, naturally speaking, of the various efforts that ASEAN has made in our part of the world. The so-called ASEAN-led processes or efforts that demonstrate ASEAN's centrality in architecture building in East Asia. All of you in this room, no doubt, are very familiar with the ongoing ASEAN community efforts that is now to be completed at the end of this year in 2015 after more than a decade of efforts, an ASEAN community in the economic domain, political security domain, as well as in the socio-cultural domain. An effort that has been consuming all countries in ASEAN. But beyond our own internal ASEAN efforts, ASEAN has at the same time been facilitating and initiating several processes, the so-called ASEAN Plus Ones, with China, with Korea, with Japan, Australia, and others, ASEAN Plus 3, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, whether it be on political security issues, and as well, not least, on economic and trade facilitation efforts. Many of you would be familiar, for example, with the current ongoing efforts on the regional comprehensive economic partnership that ASEAN is initiating with its dialogue partners, and which is also set to conclude or to make substantial progress by the end of this year. I am mentioning those again to illustrate how congested and how prolific is this type of architecture building efforts in the eastern part of our Pacific. Of course, beyond ASEAN, we are familiar with other processes. APEC, with its efforts to the promotion of the free trade for the Pacific idea. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and not least, we haven't spoken much about it, FREALAC, the Forum for East Asia and Latin America Cooperation, which, by the way, Colombia co-chaired with Indonesia just over 2 years ago now. So we have a tremendous amount of efforts. They all fulfill certain functions. They are product of certain period of time. And not least as well, we have many other inter-regional efforts, Asia-Europe, Asia-Africa, even all the way from 60 years ago, and many other processes. I mention those processes again, not to discourage, but rather to put matters in a wider context, so that our current efforts and our efforts at identifying the agenda for Pacific cooperation becomes a little bit more contextual. What kind of agenda are we to promote in Pacific cooperation? Just looking at the program of work over the past couple of days, we are very quickly come to awareness that there is actually a huge amount or scope where we can be collaborating and cooperating. Functional issues, economic, political, security. But how do we bring order to such a huge magnitude of possible topics for discussion? We have learned throughout the past 2 days of the Pacific Alliance perspective, and all of us are in agreement. It is a fantastic effort, and we wish to align ourselves with these efforts. But how do we bring order to this apparent, if we are not careful, a paradox of plenty? A lot of processes, but no clear benchmark for progress to be measured. I'd like to propose, by way of my own personal opinion, and based on the recognition, as I had said yesterday, there is actually a very close correlation and indivisibility between political security issues and economic issues. No one can pretend that the two issues are separated. I think, of course, we can make an effort to delineate agenda and topics as if they are divided, but the reality is, nowadays, economics and politics, national, local, national, regional, and global, they are all intertwined. Based on that premise, and based on that recognition, and not wanting to shy away from that reality, I'd like to propose a simple 2-point agenda for Trans-Pacific cooperation. It is, of course, a caricature, and at the risk of oversimplification of the kind of problems that we face and opportunities, but simple 2-point agenda. One is simply connectivity. Connectivity defined in a very broad manner. We have physical connectivity, of course. We have institutional connectivity and people-to-people connectivity. I chose this theme, connectivity, because it's something that is prevalent basically throughout all regional or sub-regional cooperation that we can think of in the Pacific. We certainly have it at the national level. All national governments are promoting efforts to strengthen their connectivity capacity. Sub-regional connectivity efforts in Southeast Asia, we have between Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia, between Indonesia, the Philippines, and Brunei. Southwest Pacific Dialogue among the Mekong River countries. ASEAN connectivity, there is even a blueprint for such an effort. In APEC connectivity, in East Asia Summit, and no doubt, I'm sure, in this neighborhood, there is also a strong connectivity efforts. So if we can have that as a guiding principle or organizing thought, then we can connect the missing dots. Because what we have now are probably connectivity efforts that are in isolation from one another. A trans-Pacific dialogue can add value by connecting the outer dots. And this is certainly what Indonesia, through ASEAN, has been doing. National level, sub-regional level, ASEAN plus ones, East Asia Summit, connectivity running through APEC, running through those efforts. The second theme or second cluster of agenda I'd like to propose is how can we promote a Pacific, meaning here a peaceful Pacific Ocean. I know again some of us may have different comfort level whether we should be discussing issue of political security issues here in this type of forum, or at least as a trans-Pacific agenda. But again, I believe that it's best that we recognize and confront this reality. After all, countries in the Pacific, we have all been beneficiaries of a peace dividend. The decades of peace in our region have enabled our countries to pursue economic development. We must ensure in the 21st century we have the right kind of peace framework and architecture for the promotion and consolidation of peace that is relevant for the world of today, not the world of post or during Cold War type of orientation. And I remember yesterday throughout the discussion, some were asking about the role of China, where to place Pacific Alliance and where we place ourselves in the kind of equation that we have. I sometimes feel that the kind of framework that we are adopting is still a very much either or zero-sum game type of relationship. Let me just illustrate this by some examples. In our part of the world, in East Asia, I believe that at the present time, the type of security challenge we are facing are at least of three forms. One is how we transform trust deficit into strategic trust. And throughout the course of our discussion today and yesterday, we have come back time and again on the issue of trust, whether it be at the national level, local level, regional, and global. In our part of the world, in East Asia, notwithstanding the proliferation of various confidence-building efforts, IRF and many others, actually, when all is said and done, there is still trust deficit, and there is a need for transformation to a strategic trust. The second issue in our region is territorial disputes. How can we manage, and even better still, resolve those disputes peacefully? And the third point is how do we manage change? The reality that countries become more prominent, how do we face this reality not as a problem, not as a challenge, but as an opportunity to be embraced by having the concept of common security, security as a common goods, not something to be enjoyed at the expense of the other. No doubt, the experience of Latin American countries can add to the kind of list of challenges that we face, internal challenges that we heard yesterday in a very eloquent session, in a very good session that we heard yesterday of the different situations faced by countries in East Asia and Latin America. Connectivity, and second, how do we promote peace in our region? ASEAN is an example. In the 60s, 70s, Southeast Asia was a region marked by open conflict, tensions, distrust, yet throughout its existence, ASEAN has transformed the situation. not by accident, but constant nurturing and investing in changing distrust to a strategic trust. ASEAN political security community, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, the non-use of force among ASEAN. Over the recent years, the past Indonesian government have tried to infect in a positive way the ASEAN experience beyond Southeast Asia. We have the Bali Principles of the East Asia Summit, non-use of force among countries of East Asia, peaceful settlements of disputes. I'd like to propose that countries of the Pacific, bearing in mind, it is after all supposed to be a Pacific geographical expanse, put our minds to having some kind of basic norms and principles of how we govern our relationship that can be good not only for today, but for years and decades to come. Those, John, are some of the thoughts that I wanted to share. Obviously, impossible in the limited time that we have to try to identify a coherent sets of agenda for the Pacific cooperation, but trying to bring some kind of order to the wonderful, in a way, positive anarchy that we have, because the proliferation process is not something to be looked at negatively. But if we are to focus our efforts, I believe that those two themes, connectivity and promoting a Pacific Ocean, is something that may be worthwhile to promote in the future. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Pak Marty, thank you very much for those thoughts, and indeed one of the purposes of this dialogue is to tease out what are the practical areas in which one can look forward. I think it's important also to having had this focus on the Pacific Alliance, a perspective from Brazil, a major global power that is an Atlantic country, but also has its own particular relation with the Asia-Pacific. Sasra Amorim, the floor is yours.
Can I speak from here?
If you like, absolutely.
People here from
yes, perfectly.
Yes? Thank you. So I'll do it from here, because I think it's more of a conversation really than a. I want to thank the organizers, Dr. Chipman. I want to thank very much the Colombian government, especially Juan Carlos Pinzon, whom I know was behind this invitation also. One of the good things of not being in government is being able to accept the invitations of IISS in a more leisurely way. I must say I was also very much encouraged by the speech I just heard by my former colleague. We're both former Foreign Minister, Mr. Natalegawa. But let me say two or three things about this question of the Trans-Pacific Association or partnership or whatever, and also a little bit inevitably about the Pacific Alliance. Well, the first thing is, of course, that I was a bit intrigued. I mean, being a country totally in the Atlantic, actually having the longest coastline in the Atlantic, people sometimes don't know that, like Brazil, being totally immersed, so to say, in that ocean, which, by the way, has already, in that ocean, and I would like to say South Atlantic, because geopolitically Brazil is totally in the South Atlantic, although the equator cuts on part of it, and we have already created in the South Atlantic a zone of peace and cooperation. So I think that could be a good example to be followed by this Trans-Pacific effort. Of course, these are all developing countries. In a way, it's an easier connection, and that's why we also try to avoid the idea of having the South Atlantic linked to the whole of the Atlantic problematic. So I was a bit intrigued by the invitation, but I thought, well, maybe they want me to make some comparisons, because in the last few years, especially the last year or so, we heard so many comparisons between the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, all of them to the detriment of Mercosur. And I was thinking maybe I should say something in favor of Mercosur. And I mean, one of the things that I could say is that the trade between the four Mercosur countries is at least 2.5 times the trade between the countries of the Pacific Alliance, Of course, the Pacific Alliance is a newer thing, so these may still change. But let us have things under perspective. And Brazil alone continues to be one of the countries that receive, in spite of the difficulties of the moment, nobody can deny that there are difficulties, including on the economic sphere. But Brazil last year was the 5th, I believe, receiver of foreign investment. Actually, although the absolute number decreased, the relative number improved because actually Britain got worse a little bit. So Brazil had this surpass, so to say, of Britain and became the 5th country on foreign. Most of the others were, well, the United States, China, Hong Kong, and I'm not sure if it was Singapore, but I think mostly Asian countries, which shows the importance, of course, and the dynamism, and the United States. So let us put things under perspective in this way. The other aspect, and this is mostly maybe a reply to the Brazilian media, but also I think has a more general implication, is that Brazil is not interested in having integration with the country. That's not true. We have free trade agreements with all the countries of South America except Suriname and Guyana, which have a different status because they are much less developed. But we had finished those agreements much before the Pacific Alliance was created. And actually, by 2019, practically, not all, but in some cases, it's all our trade. For instance, in Chile, it's 100%. With other countries, it will be 90%. But most of the cases in which it's not 100%, it was not the fault of Mercosur, but the difficulties that some of our Pacific countries had with agriculture because of the competitiveness, not only of Brazil, but also Argentina and Chile. With Mexico, it's a little bit different, and there were fluctuations. There were moments in which Mexico wished to have a free trade agreement with Mercosur, and Mercosur was more reluctant because of a pertainance to NAFTA. And there were moments in which the Mercosur wished to have a free trade agreement with Mexico, and Mexico was more reluctant because of Brazilian or Argentinian or Uruguayan agriculture and what that could cause in Mexico. So it's not that picture of a bright sun rising over the Pacific and, of course, setting in the Atlantic. That doesn't correspond to the truth. And even there was a moment not so far ago in which one of very important leader of a very important country told me and told our president that our country is wedded to an elephant, and the elephant is moribund. Of course, the elephant now relieved, and maybe that can change things. But these questions are questions that have to be seen with some relativity. Other point that I would like to make, and that's probably one of the main points, is the the nuances, so to say, in purpose. And I enjoyed very much the speech by Mr. Natalegawa because he emphasized a lot peace and security. Well, Mercosur and UNASUR, which is the organization for the whole of South America, were first and foremost political moves. Trade might have been its instrument, but for us, trade was never, let us say, the magic thing that would bring prosperity immediately. We believed a lot in our internal markets. They have worked for some time, sometimes not so much, but in any case, the internal market of Brazil and Mercosur as a whole was always a very important thing for us in commercial terms, in economic terms. But at the same time, we thought it was essential to create a zone of peace and cooperation in which war is not only banned in the documents, but in which war becomes unconceivable in the Karl Deutsch sense of the term of a security community. So that's what we have worked in Mercosur, and that's what we have done in UNASUR. Don't forget, for instance, that Mercosur started not so much with a trade agreement, but the first important agreement, or maybe it was simultaneous, but one of the biggest agreements that we made of greatest importance was the agreement on nuclear inspections, which abolished the rivalries in the south of the continent, which was, of course, essential for integration and for a zone of peace and cooperation. The same goes for UNASUR as a whole. I mean, we not only created, it was based on trade agreements because we wished to be a concrete thing, not of a purely rhetoric nature, but we also wish to give a political dimension. And look, what UNASUR is doing nowadays, of trying to do in some questions between two countries. It happened in the past between Venezuela and Colombia, between Colombia and Ecuador, but even internally in questions like Venezuela and in Bolivia, in which UNASUR countries did what no other organization was able to do in terms of reconciling the parties. And so I think this creation of confidence of greatest importance, and that's why, and let me now talk a little bit about my latest job, I don't know last or latest anyway, my previous job, which was Minister of Defense, and one of the most important things was the creation of the Council, the Defense Council of South America. So I don't see something similar being envisaged by the Pacific Alliance. So although the alliance is called an alliance, and we are just a union, we are much more devoted to these crucial aspects of security and defense than the other bodies. So, and I think this is something of great importance which we cannot put aside. I think this is important even from an economic point of view, because we all know that defense industry is an industry of high technology, and we are keen to create an South American industrial base. And before anyone says that that's only to the benefit of Brazil, let me tell you, for instance, that when I was defense minister 3 or 4 years ago, we have one of our 4-star generals here who can testify to that, I decided, and was accepted by the armed forces, to buy some, how should I say that, some fighter boats, river boats, from Colombia. Well, some people thought it was less expensive to buy from the United States or from Norwegian or Sweden, I don't remember, or Britain, but we decided to buy from Colombia because we wish to show that when we speak of a South American defense base, we are not speaking only, let us say, of the Brazilian Super Tucanos, which are being sold to the United States and the world over, but also we're speaking of buying and developing projects together. We're discussing a project, we were at least when I was minister, discussing a trilateral project which involves Colombia and Peru, again, for a ship, a river ship, because we detain the largest river basins in the world, as is well known. So I would think this is very important to take into account when we speak about, especially if you are in the Institute of Strategic Studies. We are not only taking trade for trade's sake. Trade must be an instrument for prosperity, surely, but also for peace. And if you're only interested in gain, this instead of leading to prosperity may have the other repercussions. So we are very keen on these matters, and I would like to mention maybe two more points. First, although Brazil is in the Atlantic, very much turned to the South Atlantic, very much turned to Africa, and of course, most of all, inserted in South America, we have borders with 10 countries, more than 10,000 miles of borders. So we have 8,000 kilometers of coastline, but we're also very interested in Asia, maybe in a slightly different way. Maybe we started in a slightly different way, but we are members of the BRICS, for instance, which includes 3 big Asian countries, if you consider Russia an Asian country. So don't forget that, and that is an institution which just created a bank. We're still to see how it will operate and so on, but a bank that may rival even with the World Bank and with the IMF, the contingency fund. So it's not that we are not looking at it, but we're looking maybe in a different way. Let me just finish by saying that these 2 ways of looking, one putting more accent in internal markets, putting more accent on the relations of peace and security, putting more action in diversifying relations worldwide, which has been to a large extent the Brazilian view and the view of other countries of Mercosur, and the emphasis on commerce as a great miracle doer, let us say, that they are not totally contradictory. They may be and they should be complementary. And I surely think that countries like Brazil or Argentina or other countries of Mercosur, Venezuela, can benefit from the dynamism of the trade in the Pacific. But in order to have a really Pacific partnership, maybe there is more to learn with the South Atlantic. Thank you.
Salsa, thank you very much indeed for those remarks. And we obviously, as the International Institute for Strategic Studies, we are interested in following these intra-South American defense cooperation efforts, and I think the latest issue of the military balance records some of this activity, and it's something that we intend to follow even more closely, and thank you for pointing out those fluid relationships. Now let me turn to Lee Ok Boon, the Deputy Secretary in the Ministry of Trade and Industry, Singapore, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right. Buenos dias. First, let me thank our kind hosts for organizing this Cartagena dialogue. I'd like to thank President Santos and the government of Colombia, Dr. John Chipman and his wonderful team at the IIS, and last but not least, the really warm and wonderful people of Cartagena and Colombia. This is my second visit to Colombia, the first being about 2 years ago in July 2013, where I had the opportunity of meeting Minister Cardenas when Singapore came to sign the Singapore-Colombian Bilateral Investment Treaty. And next year, Peru will be hosting APEC, and this will bring the Asia-Pacific more often into the Pacific Alliance and Latin America. And I hope that will give greater focus into what are the areas of cooperation that both sides could explore. I think all of us here over the last day and a half have talked a lot about promoting the Trans-Pacific relationship, and I think no one needs any further persuasion about the need to enhance this relationship. Likewise, Singapore hopes to establish closer and more substantive relationships with the Pacific Alliance members. Many speakers have also spoken on ideas that we could pursue, and under this plenary, I hope to share some ideas and spark off some discussions that we could follow up. And here I'd like to thank Pak Mati for sharing his 2 ideas on connectivity and Pacific-Pacific. And my comments, I will just keep it more to probably on the connectivity side. First, what can we as governments do on connectivity? That I will see it at 3 levels. What we could do at the G2G level between governments, what we could do at the business-to-business level, B2B, and finally, between people to people at the P2P level. Coming from a trade ministry, I must definitely advocate that we build stronger trade infrastructure. And what do I mean by stronger trade infrastructure? This will be free trade agreements, FTAs, RTAs, bilateral investment treaties, the BITs, as well as double taxation agreements. These instruments are very important because they reduce the barriers to trade and investment and provide greater certainty for businesses. In other words, we as governments could build a foundation for greater flows of trade and investments between the 2 regions. And this would really be the virtual superhighways that would then allow the trade and investments to flow. Indeed, I'm also glad that the Pacific Alliance foreign ministers yesterday have mentioned this in some way or other. But when we see the Pacific Alliance members in ASEAN, we should recognize that we have many things in common. Both of us have a great demographic bonus. We have a growing population, education levels are improving, our workforce is young and getting better trained. There's also rapid urbanization happening in both Pacific Alliance and Southeast Asia. And as many have mentioned, there is growing middle class. This demographic bonus means that not only will we consume more, but it also means that we will save more. And when we have consumptions and savings, this provides for sustainable and robust economic growth for the medium to long term. But some of you have asked, why do the trade officials take so long to launch negotiations on FTAs and BITs, and even after their launch, why did it take so long to conclude? I think that many of us will know that the greatest difficulty in negotiations is not between countries or economies, but it's actually within our own countries. It's between the stakeholders ourselves. We need to recognize that as governments, we should tackle trade and investment barriers because the beneficiaries are long-term. The beneficiaries go beyond the big companies and MNCs because often they already have the resources to deal with some of these barriers. They have found creative solutions or workarounds. On the other hand, the biggest beneficiaries of FTAs, BITs, and DTAs are the small and medium enterprises, the SMEs. because these are small, they do not have the resources to figure out how to navigate the complex web of trade barriers and investment barriers. Therefore, if we are able to improve the trade infrastructure between our countries and between our regions, what we'll see is that our SMEs will be able to tap into global value chains, they'll be able to internationalize, and this is what we call true inclusivity. The other important beneficiary of freer trade and investment is our people and ourselves. We are consumers. When we have an open economy, we get more choices, we get more competitive and higher quality products and services. This creates economic growth, and fundamentally it creates better jobs and higher standards of living. And this is the key reason why Singapore today has 21 FTAs and RTAs. We have 41 BITs and over 70 DTAs. We just concluded the EU-Sing FTA last year, and right now we are negotiating with Turkey in the TPP as well as in the RCEP. I'm glad to share that with the Pacific Alliance, we have full FTAs with Chile and Peru. We're negotiating with Mexico as part of the TPP, and with Colombia, we have signed a BIT. We also have FTAs with Costa Rica and Panama, and I'm excited to hear that they are pending membership into the Pacific Alliance. Indeed, with all these FTAs in place in Singapore, what we have seen is that over the last 5 years, Singapore's trade with Pacific Alliance members have doubled over the last 5 years. Our vast network of trade infrastructure has made Singapore an attractive investment destination for companies to invest in and establish their location to reach out to Southeast Asia. Therefore, my first suggestion is that as governments, we should be strategic and think long-term and continue to build on this trade infrastructure. Because many of you come from the strategic and defense sectors, and we hear of the need to enhance the security, and I couldn't agree more with that. But I will be a bit provocative here and toss out an idea that instead of just considering a bilateral FTA, we should also consider the possibility of a Pacific Alliance ASEAN FTA. And why do I say this? It is going to be difficult, it will be ambitious, it will be challenging, but when you have a region-to-region FTA, what it offers is that we could have benefits like regional accumulation under the rules of origin. And what this can do is this can boost intra-Pacific Alliance trade and production, and likewise intra-ASEAN production and trade. And in today's 21st century manufacturing, where everything is broken up and fragmented across countries and economies, having a region-to-region FTA makes sense because we can then allow our companies to tap into the global value chains. Another reason is that strategically, a Pacific Alliance ASEAN FTA could also be a stepping stone towards an eventual free trade area of the Asia Pacific, or the FTA-AP. The second area which I think government can play a much bigger role in is facilitating the business-to-business connections. Here, we think that governments can play a leading and catalytic role for a start, and then let the private sector take over in time to come. From yesterday's discussion, it was quite clear that we have a problem with information asymmetry and a knowledge gap. Some speakers have alluded to this, as in, why do businesses not see the potential? There was also a comment from the floor that instead of governments and think tanks and all of us coming together so often, we should also encourage our business sectors to come together, and I fully agree with that. The awareness of the economic potential and opportunities in our respective markets is very low where it matters, and what I mean is amongst our businesses back home. This is not unexpected because we are separated by a far distance. There's differences in language and cultures. However, these are barriers which can be overcome. Over the last 10 years, Singapore has hosted annually a Latin Asia Business Forum. We invite leading companies from Latin America and Asia to come together to Singapore to network and explore cooperation opportunities in Latin America and Asia, vice versa. Such a forum not only provides our businesses a better appreciation of the opportunities available, but more importantly, it allows them to find potential business partners between the two regions. Again, as I mentioned earlier, our SMEs have great difficulty launching into a new market, especially one that's so far away. But if they can find a good partner from Latin America or from Southeast Asia, this allows them to more effectively bridge the distance. We will be holding the next Latin America-Asia Business Forum in October, and I do look forward to many of you joining us then. Related to this point is that I think that we should also encourage our respective trade and business associations and chambers to establish closer working relationships so that they can become effective focal points for their members. Singapore has signed and will be signing MOUs with Colombia's ANDI, Pro-Mexico, COMEX Peru, the Santiago Chamber of Commerce, to name a few. And under these MOUs, what has enabled us and our agencies to do is to link up and foster greater collaboration and information sharing between our companies. This is yet another cost-effective and efficient way to bridge the information gap. Finally, I would also like to take this opportunity to encourage the Pacific Alliance members to lead more trade missions to Singapore and use Singapore as the hub, as a launch pad into Southeast Asia. Singapore has come a long way from a small fishing port 50 years ago. Today, we are a key trade, business, investment, and financial hub in Southeast Asia. Every month, we receive a few trade missions from all over, from Southeast Asia, from China, from India, and even Central Asia. They come to Singapore because they can reach their potential customers, potential suppliers, financiers, research analysts, insurers, as well as the think tanks and academics based in Singapore. For the same reason, we have global and regional companies based in Singapore. The banks are there, the researchers are there. We have in IIS has established an office there as well. So it is a convenient and comprehensive one-stop location for Pacific Alliance to use Singapore as a springboard into Southeast Asia. For Singapore, through facilitating many of these B2B conversations, we have also distilled 3 specific areas which we think there is great potential for Singapore to collaborate with the Pacific Alliance members. In energy and minerals, in logistics, including ports, and in urban solutions and infrastructure, including ICT. Singapore is a very small country, but these are the areas we have grown strong in and having transformed ourselves over the last 50 years. And with rapid urbanization and a growing middle class in our regions, these are the 3 areas where we believe Singapore's expertise and experience could find good applications in the Pacific Alliance. And the last area that I would like to touch upon is the people-to-people connections. I think we've heard many good ideas yesterday about encouraging more university-to-university exchanges, about promoting tourism, the need to not, how should I put it, the visa waivers for tourists from Asia coming into Latin America and vice versa has also facilitated the tourism flows. But as many of us have faced, it is a long journey of over 40 hours, and there's much more that we could do to find an intermediate locations where we could promote greater aviation links and promote the people-to-people flows. With that, thank you.
Very much indeed. You had one specific idea there about the Pacific Alliance ASEAN FTA and how even the attempt to negotiate that might improve disciplines within each of the 2 organizations. There might, I hope, be other practical ideas that come out of the discussion. So I would like to invite various people to intervene, and I'll take a number of interventions and then return to the panel. First, Tristan Garrell-Jones, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Although I was brought up in a Spanish-speaking country, if I may, I'll follow the example of Minister Cardenas and address you all in English. One of my continuing frustrations, because of my interest in Latin America, has been the extent to which, in an increasingly global village, Latin America never has, to date, punched its weight at an international level. And one of the reasons why I regard the Pacific Alliance as one of the most important events that's happened in Latin America in the last 50 years is because I feel and hope that this alliance could be the kernel around which Latin America eventually comes together. And picking up the point made by Minister Amorim, who could have imagined back in the 1950s when 6 countries founded what was then called the Common Market, which was a free trade agreement between 6 countries, that we would have ended up where we are today with 28 members and all of us together punching our weight in international matters. So my dream, if you like, is that 50 years from now, even those countries looking out onto the Atlantic, and some of them have no mention of any name, some of them have a bit of a journey to do before they're ready, will eventually join this alliance. But coming to more practical matters about how the alliance should function now, we were very honoured on Friday to be addressed by President Santos, and he made what I think is a hugely legitimate point, that he doesn't want to see the Pacific Alliance dominated by some massive bureaucracy. And I agree with that, and let me make a confession here. I have a criminal past in the sense that I used to be a politician, and but I'm now, by the way, an honest man. I'm an investment banker and chairman of UBS for Latin America. So I'm very much aware of how President Santos is thinking, because if you look at the European Union today, the Commission employs directly 22,000 officials, not to mention the people that it employs indirectly, and much of the anxieties in countries like my own and France about the European Union is because they see this massive bureaucracy imposing legislation and regulations upon them. So to that extent, I agree very much with President Santos. But having said that, it will be necessary, if I may say so, for this new treaty to have some kind of secretariat that supervises what's going on. For example, in international trade, there's a phrase called non-tariff barriers. That's a polite way of saying cheating. And you need a secretariat or an authority so that if an exporter, let's say from Mexico to Colombia, or vice versa, finds that his products are being impeded in some way or another, he needs to be able to appeal to a body that can make a ruling. And ditto for countries in the Pacific or other parts of the world with whom they have bilateral trade agreements. If there is non-tariff barriers, someone needs to be able to rule. So you need that sort of bureaucracy. The trick, of course, is not to do what the European Union has done, which is to give that bureaucracy the power to make legislative initiatives. Those, of course, I think at least in the short term should rest with the individual countries. And one last example, which we heard yesterday by a prominent Colombian businessman, Mr. Bojanini, about the union of the stock exchanges. Well, yes, but even now, those 4 stock exchanges are still regulated by their own national regulations. And in my current position, I know a number of investors, quite big investors, who would like to invest in this part of the world, but don't, because they say, well, there's no liquidity. Because most big investors will only invest in packets of, say, $5 million or $10 million. And I think, again, you need a supervisory body that makes those 4 stock exchanges become a reality. So I think in the short term, we're all right across the world very keen to see this Pacific Alliance prospering. And in my own case, I retain the dream that one day it will be the kernel around which the whole of Latin America unites. Thank you.
Felipe Larin of Chile.
Thank you, John. The issue of SMEs has been discussed over these 2 days very widely. And Mr. Lee mentioned particularly the issue of SMEs as an important point. Though I would like to know, because we know how the obstacles that SMEs face in taking advantage of
Felipe,
opportunity.
can you just speak a bit closer to the microphone?
Sure. we know how the obstacles that SMEs face, access to credit, financial markets, connectivity. Many times the most that an SME can aspire to is to be a supplier to a company that is exporting or that is trading overseas. So my question here is to the panel, but especially to the Asian members of the panel, is what concretely are you doing in your countries to enable SMEs to take advantage of the Trans-Pacific opportunities?
Ms. Wu? Yep.
Yes, Beatriz Leisegui from Mexico. Well, this, you gave me mission. Yes?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Beatriz Leisegui from Mexico. I would like to make a question to Celso Amorim. And my question would be based in two conditions. The first one would be that the Pacific Alliance countries flexibilize their prerequisites to become part of the Pacific Alliance, and in the sense that you don't have to have a free trade agreement with the four in order to become a member. And the second condition would be, and I understand this can be so, that Brazil could negotiate separately from Mercosur with the Pacific Alliance. I know that, for example, Uruguay has done that. We have a free trade agreement with Uruguay. So if that is the case in the situation of Brazil, what would be your view with regard to the possible integration of Brazil to the Pacific Alliance?
Peter Rashish?
Thank you, John. That question anticipated mine, but let me just dig a little deeper. I think it points to the fact that while the Pacific Alliance is sort of very loose and sui generis, and Mercosur is much more modeled on the European Union, it's a customs union, it negotiates free trade agreements in principle as a group. I think what this previous questioner was pointing to is that when there are non-tariff issues under consideration, each member of Mercosur should in principle be able to take its own initiatives. And it seems to me that that would be one area for further integration in the hemisphere, and that would be for Brazil, for example, to negotiate in areas related to regulation, standards, investments with Colombia and the other members of the alliance. And those kinds of measures could particularly facilitate greater SME involvement in those markets. And so I just wondered, both asking Minister Cárdenas and Minister Amorim, whether these are the kinds of things that would be welcomed and we could expect.
Thank you. Mr. Wang?
Thank you. There's a saying the 21st century is a century of Asia Pacific. But it is only Pacific Airlines. There's no Asian Airlines. So how to cooperate? Recently, fortunately, there's a Chinese or the Asian version of the Asian Airlines. That's so-called the Maritime Silk Road initiative by Chinese government. Which
What initiative?
Huh?
Which initiative?
A Maritime Silk Road initiative. Because there is no Asian Airlines, as I said. So combined together, the key also is mutual connectivities, as the Indonesia panelists argue, that trade, transportation policy, and currency, and people-to-people exchange connections. These work together with Pacific Airlines can serve for the dream of the FTAAP, free trade areas in Asia Pacific. But I would like to ask the Indonesian and the Singapore panelists, what's the challenges and difficulties or obstacles to build the Maritime Silk Road? And for the Brazil's concern, because you are not a Pacific nation, and China has another initiative. We want to build the railway, connect Asia, Pacific and Atlantic. And what's the obstacles and challenges in your understanding, which is good for bringing Brazil and other countries into Pacific Airlines and connect with each other? Thank you.
And from Chile, Manfred Wilhelmi.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman.
A bit closer to the microphone.
Yeah, and congratulations to the IASS and to our Colombian hosts for a truly great meeting. We have been really learning a lot during all these sessions. Since Minister Cárdenas is the sole Pacific Alliance representative in this panel, I would like to ask him what could be done so that the Pacific Alliance will take deeper roots in our respective societies. In a meeting like this and in many other seminars, it is more the specialists, the policymakers, important business people, etc., who exchange views, but so far I see that in our civil societies, the Pacific Alliance has not really taken deep roots, and maybe Minister Cárdenas has some ideas on that question.
Good. Well, I think I'll return now to the panel, and perhaps first start with Mauricio Cárdenas. You want to respond to some of the points you've had?
So I'll touch on these two issues, which is what else can be done to make the Pacific Alliance, I guess, have deeper roots in our societies and become a more prominent and dominant force. And also on the question of what kind of initiatives can be taken to expand the Pacific Alliance. The first thing I say is the Pacific Alliance is something relatively recent. It is new. We are still in the first stages. What is really common about the countries that are members of the Pacific Alliance is really an integration of the private sector, which was a key force behind the Pacific Alliance. I think the private sector was actually leading the way. There's large investment from Chile in Colombia, from Mexico in Colombia, from Colombia in Peru. Trade is also very important. The integration of the stock exchanges is something that preceded, the initiative preceded the formal creation of the Pacific Alliance. So it's a private business community that really has promoted the integration. Why has that been the case? There is no doubt that there is a convergence of views and convergence of economic models based on very responsible macroeconomic management, but also very open economies. We all were very open to the rest of the world before we decided to form this alliance. The alliance does not exclude. It is not defined by exclusion. It is open. And we have a number of criteria in different areas of, for that to take place. One is basically that common perspective, common view. Here in the audience are two former finance ministers of the Pacific Alliance countries, Miguel Castilla from Peru, Felipe Larraín from Chile. And when we actually we met many times to discuss the future of the Pacific Alliance from our areas, which is basically finance. We said we have to have clear rules. For example, we exchange tax information following OECD criteria and standards. Other members will also be required to do that, to exchange in an automatic way tax information. So these are the standards we're building for the expansion of the Pacific Alliance. Let me say one thing about the future, where it's going. The world in general, and Asian countries in particular, China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, are very interested in investing in infrastructure in our countries. So one of the next steps we're promoting is an infrastructure fund that will invest in projects throughout the 4 countries of the Alliance of the Pacific. So investors would like to put money into this vehicle so that they'll invest in infrastructure projects and diversify the risk across these 4 countries. These are the type of issues we're promoting. And as I said, these are standards we're adopting, and the Pacific. And let me be very emphatic about this. The Pacific Alliance is not defined by exclusion. It's not excluding. It is really open, but it's open to of course, individual countries that want to be part of it and that have these standards that we have agreed to.
Could you answer Tristan Garrett-Jones's point about the MILA?
Yes. So the MILA, for those of you that are not familiar, MILA is Mercado Integrado Latinoamericano. It included in the first stage the stock exchanges of Santiago, Lima, and Colombia. These stock exchanges were integrated in the way that you could do transactions with essentially stock in any of the three markets by just placing your order locally through your own stockbroker. Now Mexico is joining. Mexico had to do a reform in terms of legal change, but Mexico is now becoming part of it. Next step, trading not just of equities, but also of fixed-term instruments. And very importantly, if you place an IPO in one of these four markets, then you can trade immediately that IPO in the other stock markets. And in the future, and this is our vision, and very much share with Miguel and Felipe, is that we will treat investments in our respective countries as domestic investments from the point of view of the asset allocation of institutional investors, such as pension funds. So it will be considered as local. And this is very important because it opens the door for much larger flows of capital across these four countries.
Celso Amorim.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Glad you gave me the floor now because I think it has to do directly with the South America and Latin America. First, let me tell my good friend, Garrett-Jones, with whom I had the privilege to interact when I was ambassador in London. Honestly, when you try to compare what happened with the European Union, I would say that the Pacific Alliance, so far, it may change, is much further from what the European Union is or intends to be than Mercosur. I would start with, we had a great discussion when Mercosur was started, whether we should try to have a common external tariff. And it's a big if. You might say that there are pros and cons in the two things. But because we put unity above everything else, because of the story of rivalries and so on that we wish to put behind us, we decided that we should have a customs union. Because, mind you, free trade areas come and go. I mean, who knows what is the EFTA nowadays? You have probably few people in this room who will be able to say what the EFTA is. And it was the European Free Trade Association by opposition to the common market. So our ambition was to have a common external tariff. So that creates some difficulties in having a totally free agreement with countries that have different policies and, of course, had lower tariffs than we used to have. In spite of that, we have free trade agreements with all the countries of South America that are members of the Pacific Alliance, so trying to put together. Second, I would say that, again, in Mercosur, although very important, and I agree with someone who said that the non-tariff barriers are terrible. I have many stories that I would be able to tell, which I will spare you, but I could tell you that integration certainly is not something that you decide on the books. Also, you have to have good laws and good rules, but it's a daily basis. You have every day to see if the bureaucrats and other people are not creating problems. Thirdly, I would say it's not a purely business thing. I very much, I am pro-business, and I think business can be very effective, but one of the preoccupations in Mercosur was to have councils that unite the trade unions, that unite other sectors of the organized society, and that's the reason why in some cases we have already, in some cases we are discussing, social security agreements that allow people, many people spoke about people-to-people contact. What's better in terms of people-to-people contact than allow someone who paid its social security in one country to complete in another country? And that, I think, is something that the Pacific Alliance, even because it's new, but I don't know if it's one of its purposes, but certainly it's one of the purposes of Mercosur. Thirdly, in an expanded way, considering UNASUR, we are discussing a common defense approach. let me say not a doctrine, but at least a common defense approach, which again is something that brings us closer from the European Union. Let me say also that we have inscribed in our actions the idea of solidarity. So we have, I think we are, I don't know about the ASEAN very well, but we are one of the few developing countries integration processes that has something which is similar to the European Union also, by it's called the FOSEM, it's a fund by which the countries that can have more money can finance projects in the smaller countries. And I'm not speaking of something very abstract. For instance, there is a transmission line between Itaipu and Asunción, which was totally financed by that. There are roads in Uruguay that were also financed by that process. So in that respect, the political aspect, the integration aspect, is very much present in Mercosur in a way in which it is not yet. Maybe in the future it will be. I think the idea that we represent about 80% of the population, maybe 75% or 70% of the GDP of South America, to South America. Well, and maybe 50% or a little more of the whole of Latin America. Well, I don't have the precise figures now, but it's not very far from that, maybe 40%. So imagine that the 40% would be rotating around the 20% is something difficult to imagine. But in any case, I want to stress one thing. And that I think it's valid for both sides, we shouldn't see these things as non-complementarity. Because the worst thing that could happen in Latin America would be a division between, let us say, a Pacific, or the conception of a division between a Pacific alliance, which is pro-business, pro-capitalist, pro-trade, free and so on, and an Atlantic alliance, or whatever, a South Atlantic alliance, that would be state-controlled, or whatever people in other countries which are not very familiar with the situation like to say. So I think this would be a big danger, because that would put in danger our biggest advantage, which is being peaceful. That's probably the biggest thing that South America has, and I don't think we should toy with that.
Thank you very much. And I'll give 1 minute each to each of the other panelists, perhaps to respond to the Maritime Silk Road idea and anything else that they thought important. But Pak Marty first.
Thank you very much, John. Conscious of the time limitation, just want to reinforce one point first, that agenda setting, in this instance, agenda setting for Trans-Pacific cooperation, is not a procedural issue only. It is also a substantive, politically laden decision. So whatever agenda that one chooses to discuss within the Trans-Pacific, it must be one that has comfort level among all the various parties concerned, whether it be countries or regional organizations. That is why, just now, I suggested at the beginning, we must take stock of what we have at the moment and ensure that the kind of Trans-Pacific agenda that we promote is one where there is already a building blocks within the Pacific, where we simply connect the outer dots. And our friend just now highlighted one possible area, which is maritime dimension. If you look at the Pacific in terms of geography, obviously, water, the ocean, constitute a huge proportion of our geographic space, and therefore cooperation in the maritime domain is a key element. And here ASEAN, again, has taken the lead in our neighborhood through the ASEAN Maritime Forum, which we have expanded to the so-called expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum to include the non-ASEAN East Asian countries. And I can see a situation where a maritime discussion can be made Pacific-wide, whether it be on environment, disaster response, fisheries, security, and many others. And just now our friend, the distinguished former Foreign Minister of Brazil, had mentioned one area in the security domain, nuclear non-proliferation. We have just now a number of nuclear-free zones, starting from Tlatelolco in South America, Rarotonga in South Pacific, Southeast Asia, the Bangkok Treaty in Southeast Asia. If we were to connect the outer dots, then we will have a complete zone of security linking up our oceans. And by the way, Indonesia just now is also working hard to promote the so-called Indo-Pacific initiative, linking the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And just now, our colleague spoke of the Atlantic Ocean. So there is actually a sufficient body of possibilities in promoting inter-ocean cooperation. But again, agenda is not a procedural issue. We have to have a good degree of comfort level amongst all countries concerned that these are the type of step-by-step cooperation we can be promoting. Thank you, John.
Lior Boon.
I'll just very quickly touch on the SMEs. I think SMEs, like all businesses, the biggest problem is uncertainty and the unknown unknowns. So if governments can come in, help them bridge some of these information gaps, I think then we allow them to better facilitate and think of the ideas. And one concrete way is really across the region just to establish partnerships, because as SMEs, you do not have resources to expand overseas very quickly. So if you can find a right partner, that's the first step. And over the medium to longer term, then you could consider direct investments and expanding the SMEs franchise beyond that.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to draw this discussion to a close because in about 12 minutes we want to have our closing address, which will be delivered by President Varela of Panama. We have to do a brief staging break here. I want to thank our four panelists for their effort to look forward to a Trans-Pacific agenda. I think one of the conclusions I draw from this discussion, and we'll need to compare the discussions that we had also in our breakout groups and the like, is that there's still an awful lot of work to do in the area of bilateral relations between the various countries of the Pacific. Each of them still have their own agenda. I think there's some important points that have been made about connectivity, B2B relations, and potentially stronger experience sharing activity between specifically ASEAN and the Pacific Alliance. And perhaps more discussion between the Pacific Alliance and ASEAN is one pragmatic suggestion that can come out of this forum. I know that under the Mexican presidency of the Pacific Alliance there are more efforts to engage ASEAN as an organization in dialogue with the Pacific Alliance. The Pacific Alliance is 3 years old. ASEAN has been around for some time. There's been some missed opportunities in ASEAN. There's been some processes of enlargement of ASEAN that also caused challenges in the early days. As the Pacific Alliance is looking at an accession process and as convergence criteria and relating the Pacific Alliance to other institutions in South America and Latin America generally. Some of the experiences of ASEAN in engaging ASEAN +3 and ASEAN with other parts of the region, I think are intriguing lessons for the Pacific Alliance to learn. So my conclusion from this last session is that more information sharing between the Pacific Alliance and ASEAN, ASEAN to the Pacific Alliance is one pragmatic way forward in establishing pragmatically more trans-Pacific dialogue in understanding shared experiences. And Mercosur and ASEAN, I'm sure, also benefited from that. From that dialogue. So thank you very much indeed. Please thank the four speakers, and we'll just come back here in 12 minutes for our concluding address.
Thank you.